We're going to finish up section 2 of Kant's grounding of the Metaphysics of Morals. So he's introduced the types of imperatives, hypothetical, categorical moral, dealing with, that's the one we're concerned with here, right? Dealing with our free action, the use of our autonomy. What is autonomy for? Well, hopefully we will be able to produce a goodwill. We may not know for sure if we produce it or not, but hopefully we will. The categorical imperative has, of course, 3 formulae. The principle of universality, is where you act so that the maximum of your action can be willed into a universal law or a law of nature. You have the principle of humanity. Treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, always as an end in itself and never as a means to an end. And then finally, the kingdom of ends, which is the systematic unity of all rational agents acting under universal laws that they legislate to themselves and which respect each other as ends in themselves. So, when we turn then to the end, you can see that Kant here has tried to go back. He says, we can end where we started, the concept of the unconditionally good will. That will is absolutely good which cannot be evil, that is, whose maxim, when made into a universal law, can never conflict with itself. This principle is therefore also its supreme law. Act always according to that maxim, whose universality as a law you can at the same time will. So he's just going back through, right, and giving you the ground of the categorical moral imperative as universality, coming from a being who wills its own rules, who self-legislates. When we think about autonomy, we break it down. Auto, nomos, self-law, self-governing, self-legislating. It legislates itself to itself the rule that it will follow in the achievement of its ends. In part 3, section 3, this point that Kant makes will become more important. He says rational nature is distinguished from the rest of nature by the fact that it sets itself an end. This end would be the matter of every good will. But in the idea of an absolutely good will, good without any qualifying condition, complete abstraction must be made from every end that has come about as an effect, since such would make every will only relatively good, right? So this is, again, Kant trying to explain that in order to be unconditionally good, the will must do duty for duty's sake. It must recognize what it must do and then just do it out of respect for the moral law, and only out of such respect. There has to be like a straight line from the principle of morality discovered in reason to the end that we will. And so it cannot be corrupted or diverted from that path by the particularities of our inclinations and investments and our tendencies and that kind of stuff, right? So he says that it has to be abstract there. He moves then, the text gets broken up in the last parts of section 2, and he makes a series of important points here that are developed and sort of formalized more in the 3rd section. The first one is that autonomy of the will is the supreme principle of morality. I've been foreshadowing this, and here it is in the text. Autonomy of the will is the property that the will has of being a law unto itself, autonomous, self-governing, self-legislating. And he says that this is independently of any property of the objects of volition. So the objects that I hope to achieve, or that I hope to obtain, or that I see through perception and then try to respond to or act upon in reaction to the appearance of the object, no. I can act independently of that. And again, we'll see this developed a little bit in the 3rd section of the grounding. Kant, there is disagreement among Kant scholars about how exactly to interpret this sort of the metaphysical state that Kant is describing here. because it seems like there's a kind of two planes of existence, or sometimes it's called the two worldview, where you have the world of appearances, the sensual world. That's the language we'll talk more about in in the upcoming section 3. And then you have this like rational or intelligible world. It's like a quasi-Platonic setup, but the human beings in our subjectivity, which is a concept again we'll develop a little bit more, humans in our capacity to will, our capacity to reason about ideas and abstractions and the rules that govern our experiences and so on and so forth, that's all happening at a level like separate from. And we can sort of take a step back and assess the situation in the sensual world and then make interventions, causal interventions into it. So we'll talk more about that when we discuss the third section. And we'll discuss some issues with the metaphysics of freedom, and we'll talk a bit about distinctions between determinism, libertarian free will, or a compatibilist view. And it seems as though Kant is sketching out what would amount to a compatibilist view. To say that is a little bit anachronistic. That is a more contemporary way of framing the problem that is foreign to Kant's system. But it's somewhat helpful. I mean, it's not completely inappropriate. So we'll talk about that. So again, because the autonomy is producing the rules, it has within it the very form of rule giving itself, and it uses that in order to govern itself. Right? It's all self-referential. It's both what produces the rule and the thing that subjects itself to the rule. It is both the governing and the governed, right? It's because it's self-contained in that way, it's able to produce this sort of purely goodwill from the strict principle of morality that it finds in reason under that categorical imperative, okay? When he turns then to the next section, the heteronomy of the will, and he says that the heteronomy of the will is the source of all spurious principles. So the heteronomy of the will just means that all of our particular wills, and my will within itself, is pulled in all kinds of different directions. It's heteronomous. It doesn't have one singular end, one formal abstract end that it's always aiming toward. It wills all kinds of different things from day to day. And between us, different people have all kinds of different things. I think for Kant here, the point is it's more important to think that my own will is heteronomous in this way. It has a diversity of ends that it pursues, and it's not guided by one sort of singular thing. So this is what gives rise to what he calls spurious principles of morality. Because I want to do things that are good, but only good relative to this or that particular end. It's good for this specific thing that I want to do. Lying right now is good for helping me to cheat on this test, or to keep my partner from getting mad at me if they, look funny in their new hat, and I don't want to tell them that their hat doesn't look good on them, right? That is good for a particular thing, but it's totally against that the categorical imperative, right? It can't be universalized, and it's an exception. It's treating them as a means, right? I'm not really respecting their autonomy. I'm trying to elicit a particular response out of them that will satisfy my needs, and so on and so forth, right? So this is again one of the big reasons why Kant doesn't think we can derive morality from empirical examples. And if you look back a little earlier in section 2, I think it's in section 2, he says that we need the a priori concept of the good, which is discoverable in reason, in order to judge any particular empirical fact to be good or not. I mean, he even uses the example of Christ, that we don't learn what the good is from observing the example of Christ. We recognize the good in the example because of an a priori principle that is inherent to reason itself, which allows us to recognize the good when we encounter it in the particular. right? So you have to have that purely formal ground that allows you to judge good things when you see them. How do I know my happiness is good? Well, because I've judged it to be good according to the idea, which I must have already had before I encountered happiness in order to judge then that happiness was good once I encountered it. Right? So this just goes back to all of his sort of formalistic, that you must ground ethics in a metaphysics, right? A metaphysics of morals, which is what he's been trying to do here. Then he says at the bottom, the next section, we classify, or the classification of all possible principles of morality founded upon the assumed fundamental concept of heteronomy. Here, as in elsewhere, human reason in its pure use, so long as it lacks a critical examination, first tried every possible wrong way before it succeeded in finding the only right way, he says. All principles that can be taken from this point of view are either empirical or rational. The first kind, drawn from the principle of happiness, are based upon either physical or moral feeling. This is what you see in utilitarianism. You see this in all of that kind of Hume, moral sentiment sort of language. And so Kant is definitely sort of trying to do something different, trying to break out of that sort of tradition of moral philosophy that he sees as, filled with spurious principles. He says right there, empirical principles are wholly unsuited to serve as the foundation for moral laws. For the universality which such laws ought to hold for all rational beings without exception is lost if the basis of these laws is taken from the particular constitution of human nature or from the accidental circumstances in which such nature is placed. So it can't come from something particular to human beings. Rationality, as Kant sees it, isn't necessarily particular to us. The laws of reason are sort of inherent in nature. Well, so God is rational, and God is not human. So I think it's worth noting that when Kant is talking about all rational creatures, we might, from our contemporary standpoint, say something like, we could imagine other rational, like alien life forms. We look at something like Star Wars or like in the Marvel universe, and you encounter all kinds of intelligent alien creatures in Star Trek, and they display rationality in a way that is analogous to human reason. So we all participate universally in sort of the same form of reason across all of these different sort of alien species and so on and so forth. Kant does not have that in mind, right? I think you can expand it. I think it makes sense to talk about that, the way that Kant presents it here. But Kant is thinking, I would suspect, that of God as the other kind of rational creature that is perfectly rational and that gives the world its sort of like rational character. The laws of nature are rational. Laws of like gravity and thermodynamics and push and pull mechanics that Kant would have been more familiar with, that kind of thing. Is certainly a reflection of a kind of universal rationality, the ratio, the order of the universe there. So it's not that we have a peculiar or a particular faculty for rationality. No, we have access to a kind of universal reason. And then we also don't want to ground our ethics on whatever particularities that we might encounter, and even if we can apply reason to it, right? We want to derive sort of the pure moral principle from reason itself, right? So all that moral sentiment, moral feeling stuff that you would see, for instance, in like Mill, that's no good for Kant. Kant doesn't believe that you can ground ethics in that whatsoever. It produces spurious, sort of self-interested moral principles. So he talks a bit here. He offers some more interesting refutations of that, but that's a theme that's just recurring sort of throughout there. you can see at the end of the second section, he says, again, an absolutely good will, whose principle must be a categorical imperative, will therefore be indeterminate as regards all objects, and will contain merely the form of willing. And indeed that form is autonomy. This is to say that the fitness of the maxims of every good will to make themselves universal laws is itself the only law that the will of every rational being imposes on itself without needing to assume any incentive or any interest as a basis. So you need that formal structure. Again, because the reason is making the rules, it has the form of the rule in itself. Because the will is able to display that diversity of ends, because it wills all of these particular ends, it must have the form of willing in itself. And this is sort of where autonomy arises as the supreme principle of morality, because it is the form of willing that provides us with the rule and is the sort of object of respect, because the autonomy can will, and it can, therefore, is an end in itself. It is the commander of respect, right? So because we have a capacity of reason that will produce rules that we can follow to achieve our ends, the whole sort of procedure of this willing process is autonomy, to self-legislate through our faculty of reason rules that we then submit ourselves to in order to achieve an end that we have chosen for ourselves, right? So this whole sort of process of self-governing. So the very form of willing itself, which commands our respect because of the rules that it's able to produce through reason, right? That is the sort of formal basis. That's the formal ground of morality, according to Kant, right? So there we've gotten to it at the end of the second section. Autonomy is the supreme principle of morality. So I will close there, and we will move then to the third section in the next videos. Thanks.